We all know that social media can be a really powerful tool for shaping narratives and connecting with new audiences, but it also presents real and significant challenges, especially for organizations that are working to bridge divides. As you all know and probably experience regularly, it rewards outrage over nuance. It stretches our already limited capacity and resources and can often limit us to preaching to the choir. So through this project, we really wanted to test whether sharing resources, building skills together, and cross-promoting each other's work could help amplify both our individual and our collective impact. And spoiler alert, in brief, it did. So today we're really excited to share with you all what we learned through this process. We hope whether communications is just one small part of one person's job at your organization, or you have a dedicated team and strategy already in place, we hope that some of the insights we share today will help meet you where you're at and offer some kind of food for thought to support your next steps. So jump to the next slide. Here's a quick look at what we're going to cover today. There are 7 sections, which looks a little daunting, but don't worry, we're going to move through each of them quickly. We're going to start with a brief overview of the project and the communication challenges that inspired it. Then we'll share what we learned from an exercise we did where we visualized the digital footprint of the pluralism-oriented organizations on social media. That's a mouthful, but Ashley will walk you through what that means shortly. During the second half, Kieran's going to help us get tactical. So we're going to dive into some tools, some strategies, and some real-world examples you can use to help expand your reach and better understand your impact online. And then we're going to close with some reflections and ideas from where we can go collectively from here, with time at the end for Q&A. So our goal, we can jump to the next slide, for the next 90 minutes is pretty simple. First, to give you a clearer picture of who's engaging with our content online and where there's untapped opportunity to reach new audiences. Second, to help share some actionable tools and tactics that can help grow your digital presence, tailored specifically for mission-driven organizations like yours. And then finally, to hopefully help spark some new ideas for collaboration. We know time and resources are limited, so we want to offer some models that for new collaboration and working together. We've also pulled together a toolkit that includes everything we're covering on the call today and more. And Griffin's going to drop a link in the chat, so would encourage you to explore that after the session or share it with folks in your organization who are thinking about your online presence. Jump to the next slide. Really grateful today to be joined by our project collaborators. So today you're going to be hearing from Ashley Fabrizio, who's the head of research at More in Common, and Kieran O'Connor, who's the former chief marketing officer at Braver Angels and our resident go-to social media expert. They'll be walking us through much of the presentation. But also really excited today to be joined by 3 amazing members of the community of practice we've been running. So Cambria Findley Grubb, the Director of Communications at Listen First Project, Victoria Rometta, the VP of Operations and Technology at More Perfect Union, and Rabia Meharotra, who is a political analyst and communications associate at More in Common. All 3 of them will be pausing throughout so that they can share case studies and honest reflections, both their successes and their struggles navigating different social media tools and resources. So just want to acknowledge and appreciate just the vulnerability that they're bringing to today's conversation, and hope that you all will do the same. A quick note on how you can engage in today's discussion. We'll jump to the next slide. Would encourage you to use the Q&A box to submit questions. We'll be weaving in answers throughout. Griffin will be responding to them live in the chat, but then we'll also leave time at the end to answer any unanswered questions or others that you have at the end of the presentation. Could somebody just post maybe a thumbs up emoji in the chat to let me know that you all have access to the Q&A? So I'm not giving you instructions you can't deliver on. Well, hopefully someone will post a thumbs up emoji for me shortly. Perfect. Thank you, Emily. Appreciate it. And then we just encourage you to use the chat to react. You've all shared your favorite emojis. Please use them today. Share resources, use emojis to challenge ideas, name what's resonating. I know that webinars can feel a bit impersonal, but as you saw in the opening icebreaker, you're among friends. So just encourage you to chime in and share. Great. We'll go to the next slide. So before I pass it off to my colleagues and we jump into the tactics, I just wanted to take a minute to zoom out and share the broader purpose of this project. The challenges to building a more pluralistic America are real and urgent, right? Rising mistrust, deepening polarization, erosion of democratic norms. The list is far too long to name in full, but everyone on this call today is doing really critical work that helps meet this moment. Some of you are helping Americans connect across political lines. Others are redesigning and reimagining public spaces, supporting local journalism, safeguarding our elections, or advancing interfaith collaborations. And while the scope of our work is diverse, we are united by a common thread. We're all helping to nurture a culture and practice of pluralism in America. Next slide. We know that pluralism might not be the word that everyone here uses to describe their work, and that's completely fine. We've just found it for the purpose of this project to be a really helpful framing to surface shared values among a lot of diverse efforts, while also opening up new opportunities for connection and collaboration. There are a lot of different definitions of pluralism out there. For this project, we drew a lot of inspiration from New Pluralists, who defines pluralism as both a worldview and a practice, one that honors each person's dignity, embraces difference, and invites collaboration to solve shared problems. Throughout the project, you'll hear we've used the term pluralism ecosystem to describe a kind of informal cross-sector network of organizations that are working to advance pluralistic values in America. So a little bit of context there. But just want to underscore that in today's media landscape, advancing this vision takes more than just strong programming and innovative research. It really requires strategic and compelling communications, the kind that can help reach broad audiences and shift larger narratives. And so that's what we set out to begin to unpack and explore. How are pluralism-related organizations showing up online? And how can we grow in reach? How can we grow our reach and impact? So no single organization can shift culture alone, but when we share insights, align efforts when appropriate, and amplify one another's voices while still honoring what makes each of our work distinctive, we can expand both our individual and collective impact is the theory of change that was really driving this project. So one last slide of context before I pass it off to Ashley. In recent years, New Pluralist has been working hard to cohere, strengthen, and connect this growing ecosystem of organizations that are advancing pluralism. And as part of that effort, last year, they conducted an ecosystem assessment that mapped the breadth of work, which spans at least 11 focus areas, from narrative change and democracy to faith-based initiatives and belonging. You can see them all on this slide. We're going to drop a link to their full report in the chat for anybody who's interested in reading it. I just want to note that for this pilot, our project primarily focused on just one slice of this broader ecosystem, so organizations that are working to bridge divides and reduce toxic polarization. And again, the aim of this project was really to experiment, to test strategies for skill building, for resource sharing, and for peer learning, to help all of our organizations better navigate digital challenges and strengthen the impact and presence of our organizations online. So with that framing in mind, I'm excited to pass it off to my colleague, Ashley, who will dive in.
Allow me to unmute myself. Okay. So hi everyone. I am the head of research for our US team at More in Common, and we identified at least 6 common barriers facing the pluralism ecosystem on social media, and we focus on this project on the first 4, which we feel we have the most agency over. So these include high costs and limited resources. I think for a lot of our comms folks and strategic folks at all of our organizations, this list will not be unfamiliar to us. There are significant staff time, startup costs, and vendor fees that a lot of groups in our space really just can't afford to purchase at the same levels that corporations do, using these tools and having these dedicated comms and social media staff teams. It's also difficult to reach our key audiences, to find them and then engage them online. And so we have a need for a more rigorous audience understanding. There are also a lot of siloed efforts, not because we want to all be siloed, but because it's hard to collaborate. Staff time issues on this, resourcing issues on this, quick timelines around having impact on social media, but that misses chances to help us amplify each other's impact. It can also be hard to balance relevance, which is the guiding principle on social media, but also our own mission integrity. The digital environment really prioritizes speed and controversy, which makes it hard to stay true to our thoughtful missions, our thoughtful communications. And then the other challenges that we really, I think it's just like hard for really any organization to gain any traction on is really the challenging social media algorithms that reward outrage and conflict that we're all familiar with, which really limit the reach, though, of the kind of unifying and bridge building content that so many of us do in the pluralism ecosystem. There's also the polarized media landscape, media fragmentation on social media. It reinforces our biases and it makes our messaging more difficult. So we spent the last year trying to gain traction on the 4 of those key barriers in order to pilot some new strategies and tools to better understand what helps pluralism-oriented organizations succeed and grow on social media, to expand the reach and engagement of groups that are like all of our organizations that are trying to advance pluralism, especially among new audiences, young people, etc. We want to build a foundation for shared learning and campaign amplification through a growing community of practice. And that was a little bit of what this project here was piloted to do. And then also identify common barriers to impact online and explore some of the shared tools at our disposal and some strategies to overcome, use those tools to overcome some of our barriers. And then also we had the goal of mapping how some of our pluralism-oriented organizations and audiences do connect online in order to better understand those audiences and also uncover insights and opportunities on the social media marketing side. Yes. Okay. So to help strengthen overall the pluralism movement's digital strategy, we set out to try to understand how our organizations are connected on social media. And we did this by visualizing just part of the pluralism ecosystem on social media. Let me show you what that looks like in a minute. First, I'll tell you what our goals are. To better understand the diversity and structure of the online networks of the pluralism ecosystem, asking these questions. How much do our online audiences and networks overlap? Are we reaching the same people online, or are we reaching different communities? And then how can we expand our collective online reach, our collective impact? So how did we set up this pilot? Really, it's just a pilot of a visualization. So this pilot is not intended to be fully comprehensive, but really to provide a meaningful snapshot of the online network trends and dynamics in the pluralism space. So we used the new pluralist framework as a starting point, the one that Julia talked about earlier, and we narrowed our focus to just a subset of organizations within the new pluralists, uh, just broad network and definitions of pluralism within the pluralism ecosystem, just a subset, those that are working on bridge building, coalition building, anti-polarization work, especially at the national level. So we identified 88 such organizations that are working at the national level on depolarization and bridging, and that have social media accounts. Specifically, we focus our analysis on one platform, just Twitter, just X. X is the easiest platform from which to web scrape data about followers. It's very rich data. It's a lot harder to scrape from places like Facebook and Instagram and other social media websites that I know a lot of our organizations use and focus on. So there's another limitation to this pilot is that we're visualizing just Twitter data. So what we did is we web scraped, we collected the available follower data through a third-party vendor to map a network of over 1.2 million shared followers. And that's a lot. The 1.2 million followers of these 88 organizations that we started with. Then we analyzed patterns of shared followers to understand how our organizations in this subset, these 88 organizations, connect and cluster. And then we looked at who those followers were as best we could, as on a whole, those broad generalizations of 1.2 million folks. We wanted to better understand this collective audience across the pluralism ecosystem, or the subset of it. So this is what the network map looks like here. And I'm going to put in the chat, here is a Canva link to a dynamic version of this. Let me just quickly share to show you what this is, a different one of my screens here to show you what this looks like. When you click that link in the chat, you can see that this is what the network map looks like. This is a slide deck, just 6 slides. You can click the slide 3 to get to here. But this is what we see. We see abroad, the 88 orgs are each of these dots. And then the lines are the connections, the percent of shared followers between them. The size of the points indicates the number of Twitter followers on here. So a larger point means larger number of Twitter followers within this subset of 88 organizations. So I'm going to let you all play with that. Feel free, you can drag this around too to kind of see how this looks. Kind of look at, see maybe your organization is in here. If you're part of this subset of the pluralism ecosystem, and we've got a few floating around here. And let me go back to our slide deck. Okay, it looks like can you all see these slides again? Make sure I'm sharing the right screen, sorry.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so again, as I was saying, each dot represents one organization and it's sized by its number of Twitter and X followers. And each line represents the overlap of followers between any two organizations on this map. The stronger their connection, the thicker that line, the stronger their connection in terms of having shared followers. And what really stands out here is a dense central cluster in the middle. And then of which there are 20 orgs in here. And then and 68 other orgs out here on the outside of it. This dense central cluster, this visualization is robust to many different ways of trying to display and analyze this data. No matter what we do with this subset of data, we end up with this dense, highly networked cluster in the middle. You can see me sharing, switching slides, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So what really I want to talk about the ones a bit closer in the highly networked cluster in the middle, the 20 organizations here from the 88 organizations that we selected for this pilot. So we can see 20 organizations within the cluster, including one of our partner organizations on this project, Bridge USA, many others as well. But really the majority of organizations are outside that cluster. And those organizations include the three other partners on this project, Listen First Project, More in Common, and More Perfect Union. Many others that you might be part of here. So looking closely here at this highly densely interconnected network cluster here, we can see that that this is kind of the thickness of the lines here. You can still play around with that dynamic version, but the dense connectivity here could reflect a couple things. We know it reflects the overlap of shared followers, but what does that kind of mean for our organizations? It could reflect a shared narrative space, mutual amplification, or overlapping social media strategies. Many of the orgs in this set of 20 in the highly interconnected network cluster have national profiles or operate across sectors or serve as hubs for pluralism-related conversations online. But still, the majority of the orgs are outside the cluster. And the organizations, these 68 organizations outside the cluster, have little follower overlap. The links between these organizations are present in this visualization, but they're so thin that it just can't even display on our screens. And this pattern is suggesting that these organizations aren't drawing from a shared digital audience, at least on Twitter. And this may reflect a range of meaningful differences, including our different substantive focuses, social media strategy, or different communities served. We do have some ability to compare the organizations inside that highly networked cluster versus outside of it. We can see that within the cluster, these organizations have about 4 times as many followers as those outside the cluster on average. Organizations within the cluster also tend to share a higher percentage of their followers with one another, meaning their audiences significantly overlap. And I just want to have a note on the magnitude here. These look like really small numbers. This is kind of the nature of social media network analysis. Within this highly networked cluster, we see that the 20 organizations share on average 0.97% of followers, but the range really goes from 0% to 9%. This is just the average here. And the average is lower for those outside the cluster, with a lot more organizations towards the lower end of very few overlapping followers on average. And this is for the 1.2 million followers among these 88 organizations, of which about 1 million of which are unique followers. So what can we say about this slice of pluralism Twitter overall? We can say that they're more academic and more news-oriented than the general Twitter audience, more likely to be researchers and journalists and academics. We can kind of see that in this plot here, where the vertical lines show the average on X. This is a screenshot from a vendor brand watch, by the way. And we can see how also there's significant overlap between cluster organizations and those organizations of the 88 that are not in the cluster. We do find significant overlap in their audiences. These blue and purple lines overlap quite a lot, but there are some differences. Followers of the clustered organizations in blue here are more likely to be women, journalists, and legal professionals on average. And these followers tend to have greater interest in business and politics. Followers of non-cluster organizations include relatively more men, teachers, researchers, and students who tend to be more interested in topics of family, parenting, and books on average. And you can see all of this information in more depth in our toolkit, which we have shared a link to, and we'll continue to share a link to our website where you can download the toolkit. Similar conversations, though, are happening both inside and outside the cluster among the followers here. Followers, here we have mapped over time. This is another screenshot from Brandwatch from the last month and a half or so. And we can see that engagement is like pretty much tracking pretty quick. So followers of those who are inside the cluster and outside the cluster, they have very similar levels of engagement over time. And their conversations are also similar. Both clusters engage with high salience topics like President Trump and national politics in general, and not just among the pages of these organizations, but overall, their behavior across Twitter overall. Followers of those organizations within that highly networked cluster tend to lean more towards policy discussions and global affairs, whereas non-cluster followers are a little bit more likely to focus on domestic issues and cultural concerns. So we wanted to gather a few reflections on what this means from the strategy perspective. So we have some reflections here from one of our partners on this project, Bridge USA, who is the only org of our 4 who participated in this project that's within the highly networked cluster. And they shared thoughts like this. We're sharing audiences. When they look at this plot, they think maybe we're sharing audiences and not branching out as much in our events, outreach campaigns, and messaging. Maybe our content is reaching people who are already in the bridging space, and it might not be helping the field at large reach wider audiences who are unaware of the bridge building space. And so they look at this from their position within this highly networked cluster and think, maybe we can look to the organizations outside the cluster, look at their audiences, look at how they're messaging, look at what platforms they're using as first steps towards expansion. And then we have some more reflections from partners who are here today. So maybe I can just let Rabia and Victoria say a few things here about when you're part of the orgs outside the highly networked cluster, what do you think of from the strategy side? Rabia, would you like to start here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ashley. I'll speak for the more common perspective. One thing that we found in particular was just that we're really trying to reach journalists more, and we're trying to have more of a public-facing profile to our work. And so we realized that maybe linking up with some of these highly networked clusters could be a base way to get to those journalists without necessarily having to individually reach out to all of them ourselves.
Hey y'all, my name is Victoria with More Perfect Union. I think our organization's mission is slightly different, if not almost the complete opposite viewpoint of More in Common, which theirs is more research focused on collecting all of the pluralist, organizations and publicizing that. Our organization's mission is to unite the country by bringing people together in real life on the chapter level. And so we have 31 chapters across the country, and we do events, around service projects, civic engagement, and just social gatherings, just to bring people together because we realize people are living in their silos, not just tweeting in their silos, right? And so for us, a lot of this cluster is not a lot, exclusively on X. And that's actually a platform that we intentionally chose to not engage with because it's so divisive and because of what y'all just said, which is the majority of the audiences here are researchers, journalists, people very heady and less likely to go into events on the ground and more likely to read a 50-page document about the pluralism space. So for this in particular, it was helpful actually to see that we were outside of the space. It affirmed that we are going for the audiences that we are, but we don't spend much time and effort in our X community. So thanks, Ashley.
Thanks to you both. Yeah, so I think to summarize too, I can hit our next slide here. Key takeaways, wherever you sit, wherever your org in this slice, or maybe something similar in other slices of the pluralism ecosystem, wherever you sit, there are opportunities from a social media growth perspective. And also want to reflect that being inside or outside the highlight network cluster is not a conscious choice. This is just a visualization of the data as it looks now. And that visualization reflects broader organizational and ecosystem dynamics. Neither position is better. The key is recognizing where your position is in a network map like this and using it to grow with purpose. And we have a few ideas on that. The first is connecting across cluster lines. So there's value in connecting with groups that reach different audiences. Being intentional, using these kinds of network insights to better understand who you're reaching and who you're not tending to reach. Exploring new ground. If you're inside the cluster, looking for ways to expand your reach to new or unfamiliar audiences, or if you're outside the cluster, thinking strategically about how to build overlap through shared messaging, partnerships, or coordinated content moments. And then cross-amplifying. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to highlight and share each other's work and grow together to strengthen this pluralism ecosystem as a whole and the diversity of that. And so with that, I want to hand it over to our colleague Kieran. And I also want to say something too. If you have thoughts, maybe your org is within one of the cluster or outside the cluster, or you have thoughts about maybe in a different slice of the pluralism ecosystem, what kind of reflections you have about social media strategy when you see this cluster or non-clustered organizations, please feel free to put it in the chat. We would love to see your thoughts there and how it might have implications for strategy, whether you agree with what we've shared so far or not. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Kieran.
Thanks, Ashley. It's wonderful to be here, and just to see how many organizations are on this call is really inspiring. I know I've probably worked with many of you throughout the years. I worked with Braver Angels for 7 years as the Chief Marketing Officer, and as part of that, I was overseeing our media work and social media. So today, I want to share some insights from my time at Braver Angels, and then also my time working in the broader space, and particularly on this project. And I want to thank More in Common. I think they're just incredibly thoughtful, diligent, and comprehensive in everything they do. And I'll try to go through this relatively quickly because, as Ashley mentioned, we built out a toolkit that's very comprehensive and kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of social media tactics. And I also want to make sure we leave time for the discussion and Q&A. And I think we're also going to do a couple office hours session in July. So yeah, let's dive in. Ashley, you can head to the next slide here. So I think I wanted to start kind of at a 30,000 foot view, like why does social media matter in our space? I think it's a simple question and there's some obvious answers, but it's kind of worth digging in. We really want to make sure that we are reaching audiences where they are. Um, Social media is essential infrastructure for any organization that's trying to advance pluralism. It's more than just visibility. It's about building trust and really inviting engagement. Our audiences are obviously fragmented across platforms, and so we have to meet them where they are. And obviously, different platforms will, you know, be more relevant to different organizations. Some folks mentioned they don't use Twitter anymore. I think certain organizations, you have to be on Twitter because you're really trying to reach journalists and thought leaders who are on Twitter. Other organizations, it might not make sense for you to be on Twitter because of how divisive it is. And that's a question that each organization needs to answer individually. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, if you want to increase reach, you have to be on social media and you have to offer authentic content that humanizes your audience. And we'll get into some content recommendations, but we should always remember that in addition to using social media to push your message, we should also be using it to try to facilitate dialogue. And that can come with challenges, but I think it's really important. And we can go to the next slide. Ashley, I'm having trouble seeing the presentation.
Can others see
I'm able
this?
to see it on my side. Kieran,
Now I can see it. Yep. So getting into the basics of social media, it's important to be monitoring performance and updating your strategy based on data. And so we're going to get into some tools for doing that. But I think it's always important to remember that you want to take a test and learn approach. You guys all know your mission well, and you have a gut sense of what's going to play on social media, but kind of paying attention to the data, what's landing with different organizations, what is generating more engagement with different kinds of audiences, and how do you tailor your content to those audiences is really important. Choosing the platform strategically and monitoring key metrics. So we're going to get into exactly what key metrics are and how we can monitor them. So let's move on to the next slide here. So key terms, I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with these, but I think it's helpful just to sort of overview them. Because sometimes it can get confusing with all the jargon and kind of remembering, what does reach mean? What does engagement mean? Reach is really just tracking the total number of people who've seen the post. Impressions is sometimes a word that people use within the context of reach. How many eyeballs did you actually get? How many views did you get on a video, for example? And then engagement is measuring how people are interacting with the content, right? So when someone likes it, when someone shares it, when they comment, when they reply. And that shows that people are actually absorbing the content and taking action. So engagement and reach are both important. Audience, of course, is individuals who follow the account, but it's not just followers. It's people who are interacting with your content, even if they don't follow you. I think resonance is capturing how deeply and how emotionally the message is connecting with your audience. It's a little bit qualitative, but you can sort of rank different kinds of engagement as a proxy for how much the content is resonating, right? If somebody takes time to really write a comment, that's a deeper resonance than if somebody just clicks like, right? And then you'll hear the term conversion a lot. Conversion is somebody taking an action, right? So content is about awareness. It's about reaching people. It's about getting your message in front of them, but it's also about moving people to action, right? It's about converting your audience, whether that's getting them to go to your website, whether it's getting them to sign up for your email list, whether it's getting them to actually go to an event, right? This is all a ladder of engagement and a funnel, which we're going to get into shortly. So let's move on to the social media funnel. Sure, a lot of people have heard the word funnel, in the context of marketing, but I think it's worth breaking down exactly what it is. Obviously, the mouth of the funnel is going to be the widest. And then as you go down the funnel with increasing levels of engagement, it's going to narrow. That sort of tracks the number of people who are going down into this funnel. At the top, you have awareness, right? That's just people seeing your content, impressions. Then you're sort of capturing the people who are interested in it, right? Who see it and they say, "Oh, I want to engage with this. I want to kind of find out more." Or maybe they find it provocative. Maybe they find it frustrating, right? But they have some kind of reaction to it and they're interested in it. They're kind of considering, okay, what is this organization? What are they offering, right? Maybe I'll read this report. Maybe I'll sign up for this webinar. And then, of course, you have action, right? Conversion. This is kind of the critical piece here. When you're growing an organization in this space, obviously your social media followings are important, but also the size of an email list, I think, is a critical metric because email is where you get that one-to-one communication, right? When you send an email, it goes directly to someone's inbox. They're gonna see it unless they unsubscribe. And so using social media to get people to take that additional step of joining your email list, that conversion is really important. And then I think for organizations, specifically in the pluralism space, advocacy is really important. That's kind of the step beyond a simple conversion, right? That's actually getting people to volunteer. It's getting them to do in-person events, to organize on the ground. This was really important for Braver Angels, which, like More Perfect Union, is really emphasizing the importance of getting people together on the ground. And so that oftentimes was kind of the most narrow part of the funnel. So let's move now to choosing the right platform. There's tons of different social media platforms out there. And as Ashley mentioned, a lot of organizations in our space have limited capacity. We can't be active on every platform at once. And so it's important to be strategic when you're choosing how you want to dedicate your time and resources. And I think, part of that is defining your audience, understanding from a prioritization perspective, who do you really want to reach, right? Some organizations reaching journalists is really important. Some organizations really want to put an emphasis on reaching conservatives. Some organizations are trying to correct imbalances in their population. Some organizations want to connect really deeply with communities of color, right? It's important to think about that, to define the audience and then understand, well, which platforms are those audience segments most active on. And I think research here is important, right? And that's why I think these reports can be really useful and analytics can be really useful. And we'll get into that shortly. How do we use analytics to actually determine from a data perspective where these audiences are? So what are the considerations for different platforms? We focus here on 6 platforms, but I think it's important to note there are obviously additional ones. A couple that come to mind would be Reddit, which I think can be a really interesting platform that sometimes people neglect to get on. So I think future reports, maybe we could look at Reddit. The other one is YouTube. I think that's another really rich platform for further excavation. But for this project, we focused on these 6 platforms. And if you look at the toolkit, you'll see that for each platform, we've kind of broken down specific tactics that tend to work well on each. But just as an overview, Twitter, X, again, is really good for kind of real-time updates, getting involved in current events as they happen, thought leadership, engaging in existing conversations. I imagine a lot of folks have heard about Blue Sky. It's an emerging platform that's similar to Twitter/X in format, but it was launched by people who were dismayed by the direction that X was taking. And wanted to sort of bring back, quote unquote, the old Twitter, where they felt like content was more substantive and there was more discretion that a user could exercise when determining their audience. And so I think Blue Sky is kind of a more specific subset of people, early adopters, it's niche audiences, but I think it's worth exploring for organizations in our space, given the kind of folks that are on it. Instagram and TikTok, both very visual. Instagram is really important for brand building and reaching younger, diverse audiences. I think there's some organizations in the space that do a really good job with Instagram and TikTok, particularly Bridge USA, which was one of the partners for this project. So I think for all these platforms, it's worth looking at which organizations are doing the best job on them and sort of like drawing from what seems to be working. TikTok is the quickest growing platform of any social media platform. It's the newest, but I think it's critical again for the future. And I think every organization would be wise to consider getting on TikTok. It's also an organization in which an individual piece of content can go viral regardless of how many followers you have. So you could only have 10 followers on TikTok, but if you produce a video, million views. Whereas on Instagram and Facebook, that's much harder to do. It's much more dependent on how big your following is. LinkedIn, again, is something that I think often gets neglected by organizations. People think about their personal LinkedIn and using it for posting job updates, but it's actually become a really fruitful platform for messaging and reaching thought leaders. And there are certain organizations, again, More Perfect Union does a fantastic job on LinkedIn. So I think it's worth checking out their content. And then, of course, Facebook. It's been around for a while. The audience there has changed. It's gotten older, but it's very, very well populated by people who are politically engaged. And so, again, check out the toolkit for more details. So with each platform, again, you're going to want to look at what we call KPIs, key performance indicators. What are these individual metrics that you can use to kind of evaluate your performance? Obviously, there's follower growth and engagement rate. We talked a little bit about that before. There's also click-through rate. It's the percentage of users that actually click on a link. This is pretty important, again, when it comes to digital advertising, which we'll talk a little bit about. Event attendance, important in our context, and then conversions, which can be all sorts of activities. Content best practices. Again, toolkit has more information. Some overall stuff, you want to mix your post types, whether it's stories, carousels, reels. Again, you want to match your message to the medium. So content that might work on Facebook might not work for Twitter and vice versa. So making sure that your content is sort of tailored to that. Again, authenticity over polish is almost always a good strategy. People have a pretty good nose these days for content that feels too polished, too generic. And of course, I think organizations in the space already do this, but always highlighting people and stories, I think is going to resonate more than just highlighting programs and data. All that's important too. So let's talk a little bit about paid strategy. Paid media is another word for kind of digital advertising. Oftentimes you'll hear people talk about the difference between paid and organic. So paid content is content that you're putting money behind. So you're paying to amplify it, whereas organic is just content that you're putting out there and its reach is dependent on its performance organically. There's different kinds of ways to do digital advertising in our space. Sort of the most simple would just be boosting posts. You post a piece of organic content and then you put money behind it. Essentially, you're putting a megaphone behind it. You're paying the platform to send it out wide. Then there's much more complex kinds of digital advertising that you can do through the platforms where you're really like testing different kinds of content and using their algorithms to optimize it and get your costs down. Cost per click is a pretty important benchmark. It's different than cost per conversion. You're going to pay a lot more to get a conversion, but a cost per click is kind of that target. And I think, if you can get a cost per click to $1, that's generally a good benchmark for strong ROI. Remembering again that cost per conversion is going to be significantly higher than that. Moving on to the next slide. This is pretty quick. Again, this is kind of boosting posts. That's a very simple way to do it. Then kind of the next thing down would be A/B testing. That's where you come up with two different kinds of content and you sort of test each against one another. You can also do this with email marketing, right? So for example, if you were sending out a fundraising appeal to your email list, you could send version A to 10% of the audience, version B to 10% of the audience, and then whichever version performs better, you send that to the remaining 80% of your audience. And that's a simple way to improve performance and also to learn about your audience. I think paid media can actually be an incredible way to do message testing. So moving on to the next one, how do we really understand ROI in the context of paid media? You're evaluating it based on how much money leads to how many actions, right? So if your goal is using paid media to generate new members for your organization, what is the cost that you paid for each new member, right? That would be a sort of core metric. Again, it's also not always just financial, right? Because sometimes you're just wanting to get your message in front of an audience. And even if that doesn't lead to action right away, that's traceable over time, right? That's going to pay dividends down the line. I think that's important to recognize. Moving on to some of the infrastructure that we can use to measure this. Google Analytics is a great way to measure website performance and track how people are coming into your website. Each platform has its own analytics, right? So if you're on Meta, you can look at analytics through them, through Twitter. Sometimes there are limitations there, but it's important to look on platform. Social listening tools, we'll talk a little bit about this. These are platforms that you pay for, that you feed in your social media data, and then you can sort of like run individual queries and get a little bit more of a sophisticated understanding by platform. UTM parameters are basically when you create a custom link so that you can track exactly where people came from. Let's talk a little bit about lead generation. I think this is a term people hear but aren't always clear on what it is. So a lead is someone that's shown interest, right? They've maybe liked a post or they've signed up for a newsletter. There's someone that you know is interested in your organization, but you want to convert them. You really want to get that person to sign up for an event. This is a good way to think about marketing in general. It's a common term in sales, but I think it also applies here, and sometimes best practices from the private sector can be applied. You can generate leads through what you could call lead magnets, right? Basically little deliverers of value that can pique people's attention and drive traffic. And so I think it's important to consider using what some would call CRM platforms, stands for customer relations management, but tools like MailChimp, HubSpot, ConvertKit, there's many of them that you're sort of using to track your lead generation across platforms. Because without a centralized database, it can actually be quite difficult because you're trying to track different leads across different platforms. So I think it's worth looking into that. And there's sort of different price tiers depending on how sophisticated you want to get. But even something simple like MailChimp, I think can create a lot of value. There's also some automated outreach tools. For this project, as a case study, we used one called Phantom Buster. It's essentially like an overlay that you can put on top of a platform to scrape their data. This is what we use to create that cluster, and then allows you to do mass actions at once, right? So you could do a direct message campaign where you're DMing followers. You can sort of do a data extraction. So you're getting profile information in like one spreadsheet based on your followers, and then mass actions like auto follow or auto like. It's important when you're using a tool like Phantom Buster to make sure you're conforming as well as you can to platform regulations, because sometimes if the platforms kind of detect that you're using something like this, they might try to regulate your behavior. So that's something that's worth paying attention to. And I think I could turn things over briefly to a couple partners here because they used Phantom Buster over at Listen First, and I'll be curious to hear how they found it and what their insights are.
Absolutely. Well, I'm happy to talk about that. So we were able to use the Phantom Buster campaign through this. And what we did is, as part of National Week of Conversation this year, we used Phantom Buster in two different ways. We used it as a way to contact every one of the people who follows LinkedIn, follows Listens First Project's LinkedIn on social media, and then make a really big dent in our Twitter followers. And the reason is we have significantly more people who follow us on Twitter than on LinkedIn. The big difference there is also the degree of connection. And I say that because the people who follow us on Twitter, they may have been part of our national ad campaigns previously. I think we have around 12,000 followers there versus more like 1,000 on LinkedIn, which tends to be more highly networked individuals connected to us. But when we did this, we found a few different things. We sent a DM to every single person who follows LinkedIn, Listen First Project's LinkedIn. You are not allowed to send the DM through the page. It has to come from an individual. So all of those people got an individual direct DM from me, inviting them to participate in National Week of Conversation, getting information about the campaign. And we sent a very similar DM to our followers on Twitter. Now, the big thing is that we found 100 site visits directly came to conversation.us, where we were running the campaign, through LinkedIn DMs, which was about 5 times higher than the amount of people coming from our organic LinkedIn posts. There's a few different ways. The first is just people getting a direct message. They're getting a notification. They're getting a direct contact from me personally, as opposed to just seeing something on a page. And then we were also really able to just really give more detailed information. I think the thing that is most important for us is LinkedIn got significantly more engagement than Twitter. But the big thing for us was truly just the automation aspect. I think the challenge of working in marketing in 2025 is there's never enough time and never enough money. And I think the ability to have something that was automated, where I worked with the team at More in Common to set up a DM, and it was automated and it sent the message every day over a period of time. So it eventually hit all of our followers. And it's not something that I would have to spend hours and hours and hours doing, which I have done for events previously. It was a huge time saving, which equals money saving. But for us, it was a phenomenal resource. We really liked using Phantom Buster. But for us, LinkedIn had a significantly higher response rate than we would have had on any other platform, including X.
Thanks. We had a bit of a different experience at More in Common. We decided to primarily conduct our lead generation campaign through X because of exactly what Cambria said, that it would require personal outreach. On LinkedIn, you can't message from a page, kind of a strength and a weakness at the same time. We didn't totally know who would be the best person to message from for More in Common. And I think that is organizationally just a difference. We ended up sending DMs to people on Twitter about a report that we had published, a 2-year report surveying over 7,000 Americans called The Connection Opportunity, about connection in America, especially around difference. And as I'll describe later, this was also part of our strategy in general to publish more of our data online. So the point of the lead generation was to provide a clear value add to following More in Common by providing some of our data. We had fairly modest engagement. We did not detect any reports, mentions the report online via Brandwatch, and we had a decent amount of site visits. The site visits obviously peaked with the publication of the report, so this was fewer than the original week. It could be the case that the campaign reduced the decreasing of visits. Obviously impossible to test without a counterfactual, but that was our lead generation experience.
Awesome. Thanks, Rabia. So we wanted to highlight a couple case studies that we thought organizations did a really good job in a specific area. I don't know if we have time to show this video now, but we'll put the link in the chat so people can watch it. Bridge USA did a great job during the presidential debates of creating kind of rapid response content that plugged into the existing conversation. This video, for example, got 9.7 million views, kind of plugging right into the conversation around presidential debates. I think that's worth looking at. And then Victoria, do you want to talk a little bit about your ad case study? I think that could be useful for the audience too.
Sure thing. Yeah, Kieran, you mentioned there was lead generation. That's exactly what we did here. We received a generous grant from a private donor at the end of last year, just before the election started. Obviously, a lot of folks in our space were probably pretty worried about, um, political violence and what happens after the election. So this was the right time for us to go live on some ads to get more people to join our movement. And joining our movement and joining MPU really just meant signing up for our newsletter. So this was a lead generation ad we ran on Facebook and on Instagram. And this is exactly the A/B testing that you were talking about, except it was probably 8 to 10 different variations. There were short videos, there were photos, very engaging. And like you also said, people first. People want to see people and of their like-mindedness. So we ran a lot of different variations on this. And the campaign was very long. So we ran it from September, October till almost January. And one thing I put a couple of do's and do nots here. One biggest thing I would advise folks is like make sure you do an ad campaign that has enough money and it's on there for a long enough time, because these, if you run an ad for like just a week, it's not enough time for the algorithms to understand who is liking it, who is engaging with it, and what is cheapest. So we actually have two campaigns that you could see at the bottom. One is the bottom one, is the biggest one that we spent most of our money. But when we started getting leads there, and it was pretty cheap, as you can see, the cost per result. So we paid $3.51 per person that signed up for our newsletter. Um, we realized, as Kieran said, a lot of older, pretty like-minded folks, which is not necessarily the audience that we just want. And so when we look at, who wants to join More Perfect Union and who we want our audience to be, it needs to be a wider range of folks and much younger. So we ended up siphoning off some of that money and then running a targeted campaign for just the age frame of 25 to 45. And so that told the algorithm, okay, let's just send these ads and the best ones that are more likely for them to click on to those folks. And then you see the cost per result skyrocket, right? So the more targeted and more narrow your advertising campaign is, the higher the cost. So one thing to remember is if you're looking for a high number of people of conversions, but you're looking for a low dollar amount, well then you can't really get too picky and choosy about who comes into the door. But if you're looking for a very specific type of person, just be ready to be paying a higher cost per person to come in the door. The biggest thing that helped us with this campaign is, I would say, the pixel. And I'm not sure if anybody knows about this, but this is basically a little strip of code that comes from Facebook or Instagram or any other advertising platform. And you embed it on your website. It doesn't show up, it's invisible. But basically, anytime a person lands from your ad onto the page, it fires this pixel and it indicates back to the advertising platform that, hey, they reached that place. They are likely to engage with your content. And so you then informs the algorithm that those are the types of people that would likely to engage. And so again, this makes your ad campaign a lot more efficient and effective. And then, of course, we used UTM codes as well to see which ads were doing the best. And because we used UTM codes, going into our CRM, our customer relationship management platform, we personally use Salesforce. We are able to see, oh man, we have our current volunteer leaders actually came through our Facebook campaign, which is pretty cool. So not only did we get a lead, right? We got somebody to sign up for our website and stuff like that. They got our email, but they went all the way to pass the funnel into the advocacy stage, right? That's the people actually running stuff. They're doing and they're volunteering their time to do this work on the ground. So they are now going to be fellows that we have our fellowship annually at the end of this year. So really excited about how our campaign did. And yeah, I'm happy to take more questions. I could talk about advertising all day. I've done it a lot. So yeah, this was a really exciting approach. Wish we could have used Phantom Buster, but for this campaign, it was really helpful to gain membership. We actually gained 24,000 members at the end of this campaign. Now, granted, we put a lot of money towards this. So I realize that not everyone is going to have a beautiful donor like ours that came through, but it really helped push our momentum forward and show growth at a time when the country really needed it. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Victoria. Rabia, do you want to talk a little bit about More in Common?
Absolutely. I can speak about our case study. I guess unlike the other organizations, our goal is not to facilitate in-person dialogue. It's really to raise awareness of some misperceptions around polarization and Americans' beliefs in particular. So to that end, we pursued a campaign to make our data a bit more digestible. More in Common has always publicized its data on social media, but the change in particular was focusing on data visualizations that were kind of colorful and appealing. And so to that end, we used Flourish, which is an online software to make colorful graphs, and we made Canva decks. And as Kieran mentioned, we tried to pair these strategically with different platforms. So on LinkedIn, we would post Canva decks. On Twitter, we made threads with the graphs. And thus far, the strategy has definitely resulted in more pickup of our reports. In particular, we find that commentators such as Steve Ratner are retweeting our data and bringing it to a much wider audience than we would ourselves. And so despite having a relatively low follower count on our Twitter, our data is getting a much wider reach because of this kind of new strategy that we have undertaken. And this is kind of the same approach as to why we decided to make our lead generation around a new report rather than just asking people to follow us, because our value comes from our data.
Cool. Thanks, Rabia. This last section here, before we wrap up and get to questions, we're going to talk just a little bit about social listening. And just to note, I do see a lot of questions are coming in. We're going to sort of add those in to the end so we can take all the questions at once. Ashley, before I turn it over to you, I'll just say a little bit about why social listening matters. It's helping understand how your organization's perceived, understand how well you're doing, and then understand how to make improvements based on that. Go to the next slide here. Helps you identify trends. Costs and considerations of social listening are important. Some platforms are more expensive than others. We're going to talk specifically today about Brandwatch, which is one platform we used. Ashley, I'll let you kind of dive in there. And I think you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Yes, so Brandwatch is a premium tool for social listening, but through this project, we were able to get a subscription and test it out for our organizations. It's a very prominent market solution, though, for a lot of corporate organizations use this tool. And we made this tool available to our project partners and explored the consumer research portion of Brandwatch. Brandwatch has a lot of different resources. One of them is social listening via what's called consumer research on their platform. So that consumer research tool offers real-time monitoring, customizable dashboards, sentiment and emotion analysis of people, how they're engaging with your posts and your social media presence. You can segment audiences and also access historical data, quite a lot of data, and building these dashboards, very rich. And I'll show you some screenshots of that. We used Brandwatch because it allowed us to help track some bridge building and dialogue narratives overall, benchmark against societal trends, and identify potential allies and partners within our space. Some considerations is that Brandwatch has a pretty high cost, a pretty steep learning curve, and requires dedicated staff or consultants, or else it's kind of carries the risk of data overload without clear strategy. Bottom line, it delivers really powerful insights if your org is well-resourced enough and strategically focused enough to incorporate it into your decision-making, but it really might not be suitable for every organization. So I'm just going to show you a few screenshots of what Brandwatch looks like. Brandwatch dashboards allow us to monitor and evaluate performance across multiple platforms. We can visualize trends, We can visualize mention and reach. We can track KPIs over time, and we can create multiple dashboards. It makes it very easy to create dashboards, see what's trending, all kinds of things. It can track audience engagement over time, monitoring conversation volume, analyzing peaks in the data over time to understand what content or events drove the conversation. There are these embedded AI features, so they analyze these peaks for you. You can also compare this kind of data against your own campaign calendars. So say launching a campaign and then seeing how the mention volume changes after you launch a campaign, or for example, more in common, we launch reports as our campaigns. It also provides automated sentiment analysis to help us understand the tone of mentions, positive, negative, or neutral, track shifts in sentiment across time and platforms, and identify areas for proactive engagement. So it automatically does this in the dashboard, so you don't have to set this stuff up, highlighting what kind of emotions are popping up in the conversation at given points in time. It also allows us to learn from our peer organizations. They have this feature called competitor analysis, which we think of in pluralism ecosystem more as peer analysis. So these are the 4 partners for our space, and you can really see how they're engaging across different platforms here and comparatively, and see, Bridge USA, where the mention volume is happening a lot in online news and Instagram, for example. They don't have TikTok on here, but I believe they are integrating it now into Brandwatch. It allows us to study campaigns that worked for similar organizations and understand where other organizations are most effective, and to track our own growth areas as well. See, for example, More in Common is resonating a lot maybe on places like X, but has no presence on Instagram, for example. So Brandwatch also has this feature called social panels, and through that we can better understand our audiences. We can create custom panels of audiences, say of educators or of civic leaders or of young people. You can gain demographic and psychographic insights or identify top interests and key influencers through these social panels. So for example, with that, going back to that network map from the beginning of the presentation, we took those 1.2 million followers and analyzed their interests, how that compared to X overall. Comparing to these vertical lines, we can see here, for example, that pluralism Twitter, at least the slice that we visualized in this project, is much more interested than the general X user in politics, books, family, and parenting, much less interested than the general X user in games, music, sports. Other types of insights you can look, they have the gender of folks on Twitter as well. So we can see that we have relatively, in the pluralism ecosystem pilot, we have relatively more women than men. So I want to hand it over to Rabia here for a minute to talk a little bit about the value of Brandwatch from More in Common's perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ashley. We found Brandwatch really useful, particularly because a lot of organizations don't necessarily tag correctly when citing research. And since a big part of our goal this year was to have more public-facing research, it was very useful to see where mentions were coming from and where spikes were coming from. We found multiple instances, actually, of our data being cited by prominent thought leaders that we didn't even know about because they didn't tag us. For example, you can see in this image that Grok actually cited More in Common in response to Elon Musk's tweet about the 80%. And similarly, we released a poll on Ukraine, which a prominent academic, Michael McFall, tweeted about with 98K views that we didn't know about until Brandwatch notified us because he hadn't tagged us. Similarly, Frank Luntz, a prominent pollster, tweeted about our data and our Gen Z democracy report. He linked to it, but he didn't tag us. Most recently, we noticed that several climate influencers posted our latest environment report. So we have found it tremendously useful because we're able to then take advantage in real time of the fact that people are posting our data and respond to them, engage with them, use that as a way to leverage more coverage by telling journalists and other prominent thought leaders about those who are interested in our data. So we've really found it quite useful.
I want to invite our partners here too, to Cambria and Victoria, to share a few thoughts on value of Brandwatch from your perspective as well.
Sure thing. So for More Perfect Union, we actually use Sprout Social, which is another kind of a competitor to Brandwatch, but it's kind of a tenth of its power, maybe. Brandwatch is just like super powerful. As Ashley mentioned, there's just a really big learning curve on how to understand the data and to put it together. I think the value add there was seeing how we all interconnected between organizations. And so you could connect all of our different platforms into this piece. But when it comes to a singular organization, we have one marketing manager on our team that does all of our social posts, the content creation, the email generation, all of that engagement online. And it would be a lot of an undertaking for very little squeeze, like very little juice for us to receive, mainly because the biggest data source is X, and that's one of the weakest platforms that we use at More Perfect Union. So for us, probably not so helpful, but in the context of this case study and this organization and what we were all partnering on, it was incredibly insightful. And the last thing I will say, it's also really hard to separate our organization from a lot of other organizations. If you were to Google More Perfect Union right now, I'm sure you'd get an ad, or first populating would be the other More Perfect Union, which is all about pro-union labor, and they're running billboard ads and post 18 times a day on Instagram, and we'll just never compare to that. And so there's that. And then, it's the preamble of the Constitution, so people quote it often. And so it's really hard to have these automatic data streams splice that away and have it understanding what it's actually speaking to, if it's the people are actually tweeting and mentioning More Perfect Union, this organization. So those are a couple of the key reflections that we had at the end of this project. Cambria?
Absolutely. I think we had a very similar experience. I think the Brandwatch is a really helpful tool for looking at broader context. So when we were able to see, for instance, how all the organizations were connected, there's a lot of really detailed and really rich information in there. However, at the same time, unless you have someone who has a data analysis background or who has very significant time, I found the essentially, like, the amount of time you would need to invest to get actionable insights, I felt somewhat lacking, at least for us. Now, I think that that's definitely goes to show with more in common with research and those things that you're promoting. That gave incredible actionable insight. For us, though, for Listen First Project, for instance, most of our commentary was actually around Iran because we co-streamed an event. And so most of the comments were in reply to an event that was co-streamed. So not anything that was really relevant to us that we could actionably implement. However, if you have someone with the time, or if you are doing organizations that are looking at, for instance, how we compare to each other, or what type of mentions is this one group getting, or if you are someone who is more on the research or news side, I do think there's a lot more actionable insights. But for us, that's more focused on just promoting the broader bridging space as opposed to things that are specifically tagged Listen First Project. In general, for us, I think that we would have had to dedicate more time into building the dashboards and doing some really strategic insights, as opposed to something that was a quick takeaway that we could implement immediately.
Thanks, Cambria. I think I'll go through this last section fairly quickly. I just want to kind of hammer home a couple points about integration of social media into a broader digital strategy, and then trying to centralize strategy within an organization. So going to the next slide, you don't want social media to be just a silo. You want it to be part of an integrated strategy with communications, with PR, with email marketing. So I think as we move forward and look at kind of further next steps for organizations, kind of thinking through, how do you make sure social media is aligned with all of your outgoing communications? There'll be some best practices around that, and I think that's a good opportunity to think about how generative AI can kind of play a role in combining those things. Moving on, again, the landscape is changing here. So how do we adapt to this changing platform, and kind of re-engineer our digital strategy for a new landscape that takes advantage of the importance of relations, and again, kind of brings into focus these new tools that are really developing really rapidly. And then lastly, thinking about the importance of collaborating across the field, building that strong digital foundation that's centralized within your own organization, but really plugging into the broader field so that organizations are collaborating across. They're, creating these communities of practice. They're sharing best practices and insights. That's what's really going to act as like force multipliers, right? You're going to get far more engagement and reach by collaborating than you are by just going it alone. And this can look like joint campaigns with peer organizations. It can look like shared infrastructure, which is some of what we've been trying to accomplish today through this project, sharing Brand Watch and kind of going over its power. And I think, Ashley, I'll pass it over to you to just kind of tie this up in a bow, and then we can take some questions here.
Yes. So ending here, before we head to Q&A, this project has really been an opportunity for us to test out a social media shared services model, having this Brand Watch subscription, for example, and sharing it among several partners. And it's also been an opportunity to test out a community of practice with our 4 partner organizations. In doing so, we have been able to make the most of our limited resources as we test various use cases for technology, and through a community of practice of even a small group of comms and research professionals and pluralism organizations, we have seen that it has helped the group better understand how peer organizations run campaigns across different social media platforms and then learn from similar efforts. We've learned a lot from our partners. And then with that pre-existing community of practice that, is durable across a longer time scale, we've been working together for almost 18 months now. It becomes easy to cross-amplify each other's campaigns. And so then to wrap it up here, one goal really looking forward is to understand where there are opportunities to get more coordinated. And with this group, all of you watching this webinar, to get more coordinated about building out our shared communications assets. And with that, I will hand it over to Julia and Kieran to handle our Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashley, and appreciate you all for bearing with us and for the great questions that have been coming in throughout the webinar. In these last 10 minutes, we've been tracking questions, so I'll dive in and name some of the ones that were expressed earlier in the presentation. But if you have others, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A. Would encourage all of our panelists to turn on their camera because some of these questions Kieran might be best poised to answer, but Victoria, Cambria, Rabia, you all are experts on this as well. So feel free to please chime in. So one of the questions that we got from someone earlier was for a little bit of more information about which platforms are best for which uses. So we heard, did your study reveal any data about which platforms are best for which uses, best for fostering dialogue versus getting engagement versus making conversions? In the chat, there was a bit of discussion on folks who have left Twitter or considered pivoting their use of Twitter from inspiring posts to just PR statements, or people who were thinking that LinkedIn might be better because it's less polarized. Any kind of reflections you could share on that, I think would be interesting for all.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. And again, I think I'd point people to the toolkit because we really dive into each platform. I think in summary, X and Twitter are kind of more of a media and reputation focused tool. So it's great for press amplification, doing live tweeting at events. It's less effective for community building or nuanced dialogue, I think, as many of you guys have found. So I think if you're focused on that, it might make sense to shift away from it. LinkedIn, again, thought leadership, building credibility, kind of growing your influence across different sectors. I think More in Common has found it valuable for posting their research, and I know More Perfect Union has as well. And then Instagram and TikTok, I think that's where you get a lot of emotional resonance and reach, particularly for younger audiences. That's where you can really drive engagement and storytelling using reels, using carousel posts. And then remember, again, email and website oftentimes always will be the best channel for conversions. So thinking about using social media platforms to grow your email list, and then using email to really drive those, RSVPs and donations. Fundraising, again, is a whole other thing.
Great, thank you, Kieran. Anyone else have anything to add based on your experience? We've got more questions, so plenty of time to chime in. The next question that I'm seeing is one about how you've navigated the rise of bots and scammers. So both kind of wasting your resources when in trying to reach and engage people, but ultimately interacting with bots and automated messaging, seeming less personalized and bot-like.
Yeah, I mean, dealing with bots and trolls is difficult, and I think you have to kind of weigh staff time versus value, because it's like whack-a-mole sometimes, and sometimes it's like you just have to let the bots and the trolls do their thing, and you want to engage where you can. You can use like platform filters to try to block suspicious accounts. I think more narrowly you target your posts, the less you're gonna reach bots. And then you want to keep your tone kind of conversational. But again, it's like being on social media means kind of wading into the swamp, right? And I think sometimes people are afraid of controversy, but it's like, how do you engage the controversy and leverage it without creating too much negative? So sometimes you could do a Facebook post, and then if it seems like a lot of negative invective is coming in, you could limit comments, or you could hide certain comments to try to like keep things on track. But you don't want to also be seen as censoring people. So it's something that you kind of have to figure out the line based on the platform and based on how comfortable your organization is with some negative feedback surfacing. I don't know if any of the folks on this call, our partners, want to just weigh in on like how you guys have navigated that, given the tenor of social media.
I can at least say from our perspective, for one thing, when we're running ad campaigns, as Victoria mentioned earlier, we optimize based on conversions as opposed to optimizing on clicks specifically for the reason of like, you may be paying more, but for us, it's not training Facebook to train bots for link clicks. So for us, when we're running ads, that's a really important thing. And quick thing I forgot to note earlier for everyone, when you are boosting posts, please do it from your desktop as opposed to your cell phone, because app store charges you 30% more. Just fun little notes there. But in terms of bots for us, especially when it comes to the comment section, we continue to show up. And for us, it's not about changing the mind of an original poster or a bot. It's about being present in the comment section and being able to serve as an example of like democratic social norms. So for us, even when things get really critical, that's one of the things we do. It's one of the things Civic Health Project does on Twitter with Normsy AI. But for us, doing that is a really big part of working in this space very publicly. When you're in ads, we get more bots on Twitter and Facebook than we would get on LinkedIn. And so that's an intentional platform social decision. But we continue to engage, even if it is a bot or a troll in a comment section. We will hide a comment if it is like offensive or violent or like something that like can extremely escalate. But if it's something that's just a critique or someone angry, there's a lot of valid reasons that people are angry in our country right now, no matter their different political backgrounds. And so for us, we take it as an opportunity to engage and model, even if it does lead to critique, and even if it is like never going to change someone's mind, it's about showing up and modeling, at least for us, for Civic Health Project and Listen First Project.
I agree. I think the only one thing I would add is I would never really spend time commenting on the trolls of ads. They just pass by, let it happen. It is what it is. Don't waste your time, because it's also not going to show up on your feed the way organic does. Organic stuff, if you're posting and people are hating on it, then you probably want to reply and make sure it's shown and people can see that you are real and you take people, very seriously. But otherwise on ads, don't bother with the responses. It's just going to be endless.
Great, thank you. Thank you to everybody. That feels like very practical advice, both for using your resources well and protecting your own mental health and sanity. So I appreciate those reflections. Maybe we have time for one last question that was fielded by somebody as part of the registration process that I think touches on a little bit of what you guys are discussing, but would love to hear your thoughts on it. Curious how you, if at all, you use your social media platforms and presence to create space to invite dialogue between people with opposing views. I don't know, Kieran, if you had experience with this at Braver Angels, and if you have any tips or recommendations on kind of what are open-ended questions that help elicit or spark that. Are there certain ways you've positioned your posts to help encourage reflection, or tools or tricks? Given that so many folks on the call are doing work bridging divides, how do you use your social media to further those conversations and dialogue?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some ways, it's kind of like the question, how can you translate that magic that we all see on the ground into the social media space, where people can be anonymous, they don't have that level of intimacy. But I do think some of the lessons that we've seen work on the ground can translate, kind of creating the space and setting the intention where, people are trying to be heard, not judged. So you can try to set some ground rules for the conversation. I don't think you want to seem like you're being too finger waggy. I think sometimes if you're having the conversation be in response to a specific kind of content, that can be a kind of good way to set the tone. So sometimes with Braver Angels, we would like put out a little clip from one of our debates, where we tried to really give people the opportunity to make their voice heard, like freely and fully, but do it in a way that was respectful. So then people are kind of responding to that within that emotional context. And then you kind of get, it's like that vibe is permeating the conversation and people are less likely to want to like violate it than if you would just ask like an open-ended question about immigration, for example. Then all of a sudden the loudest people weigh in first and it kind of like sets the tone right off the bat. So leading with curiosity, creating the space, and then like being really clear about intentions, I think is a great place to start.
Great, thank you. I think that's a very inspiring place to end. And so it's thinking about how can you use your social media content if your goal is to help foster some dialogue to first model the kind of like vulnerability and guidelines that you're expecting of participants. So just appreciate that reflection, Karen, and the reflections from everybody on the panel. We are at 3:30. Deeply appreciative for everyone's time today and just like the spirit and questions that you brought to today's discussion. I just wanted to note that would encourage people to check out the toolkit and to share that with folks in your organization who are doing work on amplifying your presence on social media, as there's everything we shared today, as well as much more information available there. We'll also send around the recording and access to these slides. Lastly, I just wanted to note that we're going to be hosting some office hours in mid-July for folks who want to chat one-on-one with Kieran and some of the other members of this project to kind of learn more about crafting KPIs, take a deeper dive into some of the social listening tools or platforms, or even just brainstorm what are ways we can better pool resources and share insights. So if you sign up, either I think Rabia or someone will post a link to the sign up sheet in the chat. We'll also send it out via email, but would encourage you all to sign up if you're interested in joining. We'll send you the Zoom link. It's going to be a very informal, no presentation, just folks who want to ask questions, brainstorm, discuss together. So would love to continue this conversation. We'll hope you'll join one of those sessions. And just more generally, if you have any ideas on ways we can continue to bolster and support our shared comms infrastructure, we are very open and would love to continue thinking about that and collaborating with you all. So appreciate the incredible work you all are doing. Thank you for your time today, and we hope to see you in person or on another Zoom soon. Have a wonderful day.